It may be BYU football's bye week, but that does not mean they have to stop winning when it comes to the recruiting sphere. BYU adds 2 top-tier offensive linemen to the recruiting class. One of them a flip from a fellow Power 4 and the number 1 ranked team in the country. We're talking about all of it on a special edition of Locked On Cougars.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first view and or listen of the day. And as always, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Today is a big day for BYU football, and it's not because they're on the field, because they are officially on a bye week. They are preparing in earnest for their matchup against Utah next Saturday night at Rice-Eccles Stadium. But it does not mean that BYU has to stop everything going on, and they did not stop winning on the recruiting trail. BYU adds 2 new offensive linemen to the recruiting class in Austin Peay out of Lone Peak High School, just up the road from BYU in, I guess it's technically Cedar Hills, Utah. And then also Alai Kalaniuvalu out of Bishop Gorman High School in the greater Las Vegas area. And both of these players, future potential starters, if not stars, for the BYU football program. That's my honest assessment of these 2 adding to BYU's recruiting cycle. Let's go in sequential order. They both committed right around the same time, but we'll go in the order they committed. Austin Peay was on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel earlier today, had the 3 hats out in front of him, including Oregon and Oklahoma in terms of options for him alongside BYU, and he didn't waste much time and said, hey, I'm going to be committing to BYU. Austin Peay is a family legacy at BYU, as you all are well aware. Connor, his older brother, has been a stalwart, regular guest on this program. Absolutely love talking with Connor. The nice part is Trevor, their other brother, currently in the BYU football program, and now Austin adds to that family legacy. They'll have a trio of Peys playing BYU football. That does not even mention the fact that their father, Gary, who coached all 3 of his sons in high school at Lone Peak High School, was a former standout for the BYU Cougars himself and also spent time in the NFL in the 1990s. So the one thing I know about Austin is among his siblings and his father, he is the most heralded of the entire bunch if you go by the recruiting rankings. We're talking, this is a kid who was getting attention across the country. Georgia, Alabama, Oregon, as I mentioned, just name a school, and I would pretty much guarantee that Austin Peay had recruiting interest from them. He is exactly what you want in an offensive tackle prospect. 6'7", 290 to 295 pounds, and looks the part of a future star left tackle for a football program. BYU is lucky to have him in the program, and you may be thinking, man, it was a given that he was going to pick BYU. There was a stretch there that I was not sure that BYU was ultimately going to get Austin, because I'm telling you, the interest from across the country came in hot and heavy, and we're talking multiple coaches from multiple programs were putting the full court press on Austin Peay to turn his back on the family school, speaking of BYU. But in the end, BYU wins out, and they get what I believe could be their next star left tackle. And I know that it's crazy to consider, but BYU's had a lot of good success at left tackle of late. Remember, they have had Brady Christensen. They've had Blake Freeland. They've had Kingsley Sewell-Mataia. They have Caleb Etienne right now. And all 4 of them, the first 3 have already been drafted in the NFL. Caleb Etienne is probably going to get drafted in this upcoming NFL draft cycle. Could Austin Peay be the next, and let's say a 5 or 6 man line of left tackles for BYU to be drafted? That will have to wait, as I understand he has plans to go on a mission and then ultimately live out his dreams of being a BYU football player. But you did well, speaking of BYU, to add a kid in Austin Peay, because he looks every bit the part of a future star at tackle for BYU. And more importantly, many of you know how much of a leader that Connor has been for the BYU football program. I see that from Trevor, and I also see that leadership quality in Austin as well. The Lone Peak Knights follow his lead. He's one of their team captains. He's been an absolute stud. I have had the privilege of calling his games for the KSL Sports Rewind streaming network for the last 2 or 3 years, and I've been very impressed every time he's out there. He plays with a nasty streak, and the good news is he knows he's 6'7". He has to work on the ability to gain leverage being that tall at the high school level, and he has done just that. So I think this is a really, Really savvy pickup for BYU, adding Austin Peay to this recruiting cycle. The other player I wanted to mention real quick as well came shortly after Peay's announcement, and that is Alai Kalaniuvalu, who commits to BYU after originally committing to the Oregon Ducks. Yes, BYU just flipped a 4-star prospect from the number 1 ranked team in all of the country. It's incredible to consider, but they just pulled it off. Now, what's the connection between Kalaniuvalu and BYU? Well, he plays at Bishop Gorman down in Las Vegas, but he grew up in Utah Valley. His sophomore year, he played for Timpview High School, nearby Provo School by BYU, as many of you might recall. Essentially, if you hit it right, you can drive from Timpview to BYU in 5 minutes tops. It's just that close. But he ultimately opted to go play the rest of his high school ball down at Bishop Gorman, which many of you know. If you don't, they're one of the top 10 conservatively high school football programs in all of the country. We're talking the type of facilities, the type of program that rivals a lot of colleges. It's just that nice of a high school and that good of a football factory at getting talent coming out of that program. But Kalaniuvalu joins BYU as a bona fide 4-star prospect. Austin Peay, I probably should mention this, is just a shade under 4-star status. He's got an 89 rating from 24/7 Sports, just a shade under being a 4-star prospect. Whereas Kalaniuvalu, he is a bona fide 4-star prospect coming to BYU after flipping from Oregon. He committed to Oregon earlier this summer, and BYU never stopped recruiting Kalaniuvalu and stayed with him. And I can tell you, just from my perspective, this is a direct impact of BYU season going the way it is. They're 8-0. They're obviously 5-0 in the Big 12. They're ranked in the top 10 in the country. That obviously is going to have a major impact on your recruiting efforts, and it paid off in this circumstance with these 2 young men, and more importantly, Kalaniuvalu deciding, you know what, maybe I want to go put on for my hometown team and represent BYU versus going to Oregon. I love this. As I mentioned, Peay looks like a future star left tackle for BYU. Well, Kalaniuvalu could be the next star center for the BYU football program, following in the mold of a guy like Connor Peay. It's the position he plays down there for Bishop Gorman High School. And if you believe some of the things out there, he is one of the strongest prospects in this entire recruiting cycle. I think it was Haskell Garrett, who's a former star prospect himself. He now coaches the D-line at Bishop Gorman, if I recall correctly. I had a tweet earlier this year. I saw it just shortly before I started this podcast that said that he watched Kalaniuvalu bench the 225-pound bench press 33 times. Might I remind you, this is a 17 or 18-year-old young man. A lot of guys who go to the NFL draft combine that are like, we're talking 22, 23, 24 years old and grown men, they can't bench 225 pounds 33 times. This is a certified physical freak, speaking of Kalaniuvalu, and you watch his tape, exactly that. He is physical. He is nasty. He's incredible at leading his guys, calling out stuff from his center position. And it sure looks like BYU got a major pickup in adding this young man to the recruiting class. So hats off to TJ Woods. Hats off to Aaron Roderick, Kalani Sitake, the myriad of other people out there that helped out with this. Tyus Moe on the recruiting side, I'm sure. Justin Anderson. All of them at BYU should take a bow and pat themselves on the back. Like I said, BYU may be on a bye week. That does not mean they have to stop winning on the football field. They can win both on and off the field, and that's exactly what they did on this November Saturday. And BYU should be feeling really good about themselves because both of these young men, as I understand it, have plans to go on missions. And once they return, they figure to be 2 of the major building blocks for BYU football to build kind of a legacy on in their next iteration, with those 2 leading the way on the offensive front. Kalaniuvalu, I believe, already has a mission call to Colorado. Austin Peay will have one, I'm sure, relatively soon. And I am working on getting Austin on the podcast along with Kalaniuvalu at some point this upcoming week. I happen to have, an inside contact with the Peay family. Okay, I'm just going to have Connor tell his brother to hop on the podcast, and we'll talk with Austin. So stay tuned for that this coming week. And I will also effort to get Kalaniuvalu on this show and talk about why he decided to flip his commitment from Oregon to BYU. What sold him on the Cougars? Well, we'll let them say it in their own words if we can manage it here on the podcast. But once again, a big, big day for BYU football on the recruiting front. They may not be winning on the football field today as they get ready to take on Utah a week from today, but they won on the recruiting front, and that should be celebrated if you're a Cougar fan. All right, more on this coming up on our full Monday edition of the podcast. Hope you guys have a fantastic weekend. However you're spending it, whether you're watching other football games or getting some downtime, whatever it is, enjoy it, and we'll talk with you guys again soon right here on Locked On Cougars.